Right, I'll just hit record, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming along, and I'm really, happy to be able to speak with you. Um, so, as I've outlined in the email, we're spending a lot of time thinking about museums and gallery spaces, and
Mm,
the challenge around engaging audiences.
mhm.
Um, and so, I think what we'll do is just talk a little bit about what sort of challenges you face in your daily practice and how you identify solutions in addressing those challenges.
Mhm. Um, do you want me to sort of try and go through anything specific or kind of stay general?
Um, well, if you just want to outline the general sort of day-to-day challenges, and then I have some questions pertaining to specifics.
Sure. In terms of thinking through visitor engagement specifically, um, I guess the way that we approach it, and I'm speaking very much from a kind of exhibition making angle, that's my experience, and my practice, is I think, well, I always begin with the work that we're showing, with the space that we're showing in, and with the, let's say, existing systems that the institution has. So you sort of have a framework of approaches and particular kinds of content and information that the institution might expect. And you then have to kind of add into the mix what the artist's requirements are in terms of how they want to frame their work. And of course, my understanding as a curator, as a kind of idea of an audience member, um, and and various sort of levels of editing that the institution then undertakes in terms of producing that content. Um, and so you have this kind of layered experience that you're drawing on, that is coming through from the artist and is coming through from the institution. And I would always want to sort of begin with that framework, because there's no point trying to reinvent something from scratch when there are certain tried and tested methods immediately available. That said, every project that you work on, by nature of wanting to do it in the first place, is unique. And so there's also some degree of adaptation that needs to be sort of taken into account in the process. In addition to which, there are sort of external feedback loops that you have to consider when you're thinking about what the who the audience might be, who you want it to be, who you expect it to be, and who might need more or less or different kinds of engagement depending on many things. Apologies, one of my neighbors has just started drilling. But yeah, so there's a kind of sort of a balance and a weighting that happens in the process of developing all of these things. There is a kind of minimal requirement, I think, on all sort of forms of exhibition making, that agree not to assume a particular kind of given knowledge, because that's the point of putting exhibitions into the public realm, is that you are communicating something about the work, and it's not for the people that know the work already, it's for someone that may never have heard of the artist or the exhibition that you're putting on. So there's definitely a baseline requirement, but then the degree to which you develop that, you try and draw on as many of those elements as possible. In terms of actually what that means, you can sort of again draw on the existing infrastructure that the museum or institution has available. So it might be that they only ever make a single printed sheet of information. And if there's no option to sort of change or add to that, then you can think about more innovative ways of, detailing the information that you want to put across, rather than doing it in the same way that they always have done. Equally, there might be different platforms or different levels of, let's say, detail, or different kinds of audio, visual, video recordings, apps, printed material that goes on the walls, that you can always think about in terms of trying to transmit certain levels of information in order to encourage a greater degree of engagement from the people who are coming into the show.
Well, that's a nice segue into the sort of first question. So with the emergence of new technologies and platforms, to what extent do you place a value on implementing those technologies into exhibitions? And from your role, or in your role, where do you see that relationship going in terms of balancing how much of the technology you use in exhibitions with maintaining a sort of traditional gallery space, if you like?
It's a really good question, and it's one that I think it's very hard to kind of provide a catch-all answer to it, partly because of the specificity of exhibitions, and partly because the sort of gradual integration of different technologies into exhibitions as a form of engagement, as a form of interpretation, is it's still a kind of tentative, it's an early process, or it's in the early days of really being integrated. Part of the reason for that is a kind of, again, it's sort of like, what is the baseline of accessibility for visitors? So in the same way that I was saying before about, what is the minimum amount of information that all visitors need to know about this exhibition, there is also, particularly when you are talking about technology, a baseline of accessibility to that technology. So if engaging with an exhibition which is incorporating a particular form of technology, if it's dependent upon having access to that technology, is that technology something that the visitor needs to have with them before they arrive? Does everyone, for example, need to own a smartphone in order to access the level of information that we're talking about? And that presupposes a certain set of, let's say, wealth and access to technology that not all visitors should be presupposed to have. So then the onus is on the institution to provide that technology, which then has a knock-on effect in terms of how it's managed and what the costs are, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of different sort of testing ground that different institutions are doing, and certainly we've done a little bit of at the Serpentine, and it doesn't feel like something that's resolved. It feels like something that there are different ways into it, and there are distinct positives in terms of the accessibility of the information through an audio guide, where someone has impaired vision but they're still very keen to experience the exhibition, but the impaired vision may mean that they can't read, but they could certainly listen to a guide as they go around. So something like that is really great, but it comes with that same set of who has the technology that sits on, who provides it, and who's responsible for it. So, and then of course, on top of that, when you're considering what the link with the exhibition is as well, is an audio guide going to interfere with the experience of the artwork, depending on what that is? So there's a whole load of considerations that kind of have to be, again, weighed against each other every time there's like a different potential platform to kind of introduce it. And yeah, that's the kind of principal reason, I would say, why there's not a consistent embracing of different technologies within a museum going experience. And frankly, also that they're expensive things to undertake, and the sort of level of speed of update and change is also something that is a difficult thing for a museum to commit to long term.
I agree with you. I think that technology is perceived to be a sort of answer to all problems, when in reality it sort of is a source of many problems. And I think within the gallery and museum space, you don't always want that presence infringing upon the work.
Totally, yeah.
And so one area that does embrace technology is the education sector.
Mm.
And they've started experimenting with gamification in the assigning of homework, for example.
Mm.
And I just wanted to get your view on whether there was a space for that within the gallery space. Could gamification be a means of experiential learning? Or is that detracting from what it means to go to a gallery?
Mm. No, it's a really good question. I think our answer to that, and it is one that I subscribe to, is to begin with the artwork and to be led by it, because there are always artists that are interested in these things at the moment that they emerge, and are testing out what it is about them that's interesting or exciting or different, and what it is about them that might afford people interacting with that kind of experience a different way into understanding the world, or understanding this artwork, or having a different kind of experience. In terms of, if you're talking about it in terms of like a specific application within a sort of education, like inroad into interpretation and learning, I guess again it's something that I can absolutely see the worth of it. It would be really exciting, but it only, for me, only if it was led by the artist's practice. If it was something that was produced by a museum in order to provide more interesting interpretation for schools, that's a formula, in the same way that a handout or a guide might be a formula. And in that sense, it's not so interesting to me. It could work, it could be very helpful, it could be really fun. There might not be anything wrong with it. But in terms of a kind of innovative incorporation of that kind of style of learning, I think it would be most effective and most exciting if it was led by either the artist who is having an exhibition, who wants to provide a particular kind of experience for school-age children or learners of all ages, or if it was something that was questioning the functionality and the application of that process, and the infrastructure that was providing it within an education forum, but not necessarily attached to an exhibition, if that makes sense.
It does, and I think I'm inclined to agree with you. I think that the technology should serve the work rather than overshadow the work itself. So sort of keeping with this theme of substance being the focus, I'm really interested to get your opinion on how these our sort of national organizations, our major galleries, stay relevant in terms of the conversation around societal unrest or political upheaval. Do they have a responsibility to provide a commentary on things like Black Lives Matter or Me Too?
Mm-hmm.
Or is that a case of they can comment if they choose to and they don't have a responsibility?
It's a very good question. I think I'd slightly reframe it. I think I would say that the responsibility of the museum sector is to always work to support the practice of artists who, particularly in contemporary art, who are providing imaginative futures. And that can be someone that is, engaging, thinking around new technologies. It might be someone that is thinking about specific relationships between different aspects of culture, science, or religion, or education. It could be any. This is the excitement of art, right? Is that it provides inroads into other ways of thinking about other ways of being, whether that is the experience of the artist or the experience of their imagination, and therefore prompting other imaginations. So as far as the role of the institution is, it is to support that thinking, and to always support thinking that triggers new forms of imagination, or new ideas about how we can live in the world and how society operates. Obviously there is, and the fact of the sort of curatorial or the sort of directorial role in sort of shaping a program as a whole is, its responsibility is to ensure that the breadth and variety of what's being represented is indicative of the most urgent and relevant and current concerns. Again, I'm speaking specifically from a contemporary art perspective. And to present that work in a way that is sympathetic to the artist's wishes, and that has to again be that's what is foregrounded. And if an institution isn't already somehow engaged in that, then the work that they need to do, and I include us in that at the Serpentine, is to look for ways to improve the breadth and variety of the program and the voices that are being included in it. In terms of having a sort of individual voice, there is, of course, the overall, let's say, more than the sum of its parts type of institutional voice that can be kind of read out of the program. But institutions are made up of so many different individuals that the sort of single voice or single representation of what the museum is or what it should be doing is very difficult to distill, even though of course we try and do it, and every institution does. I think there is a limit to I don't think there's a limit to the ambition of any institution. There should always be an ambition to play a role in that debate and in that set of questions. But I think there is a limit to which an institution can represent every single voice of everyone that is a part of it. And that limit needs to be recognized. So there's a certain degree of transparency that perhaps needs to be achieved that isn't, maybe it's not assumed that, or maybe it's assumed that they are more transparent than they are. I don't know how far that goes in answering your question, because it's a very difficult thing to answer that everyone's definitely in the process of working through at the moment. But I think the most important thing that museums can do is be representing the most important and current voices of the day, and that the engagement that those voices have out in the world, because they're often the voices of people that do offer different than the mainstream experience, that the attitudes and the practices and the ambitions of those voices are also upheld within the structure, the internal structures of the museum, because they become a kind of microcosm of society and what's going on. So there's work that needs to be done that is invisible to the rest of maybe the rest of the art world, or even the rest of society, that's of its nature perhaps doesn't need to be made visible, but perhaps could be stated a bit more transparently.
Yeah, I agree with the notion that these institutions should seek to accommodate the conversation rather than dictate. So, sort of staying with that theme for a moment, how do you view the relationship between your institution and your user? Do you view your audience as very much a collaborator, or are you more of the opinion that it is the museum's responsibility to sort of guide them in the conversation and provide experiences rather than work with them?
It's a great question, and it's one that is different depending on the different parts of the program, I would say. And that is because the different functions of the aspects of the program are created with the intention of offering different kinds of engagement from the audiences or the participants that might want to be involved. So, for example, an exhibition occurs in a static way most of the time within one site, and it is put there so that people can visit it, experience what happens in that space, and then leave. So in a way, that is quite a performative offering that is it's a single experience, or multiple if you come back, but that you are essentially choosing to go in order to be shown something. And I suppose that works in a similar way for live performance, that you are choosing to go, choosing to attend in order to listen or learn or watch, but that is potentially, depending on the program, is a relatively kind of passive experience. But of course, those are only two aspects of what an institution's programming might be doing. And our education programs, I mean, without speaking for them, are very much engaged practices. And the way that those teams work is to embed artists within communities and to work together with the communities, whether it's primary school age or secondary school age, or the elderly or homeless, or refugee charities. There's a real variety of communities that they engage with, but their premise is both that the projects are developed as a group and as a community with the guidance of the artist, or with the input of the artist, depending on the project, and also that those processes aren't they aren't necessarily public at any point, and they also might continue to be open-ended. So there may not be an outcome that is expected of them. And those different timelines and different levels of engagement then mean that the interaction of the people that benefit from the programming of the institution is completely different, depending on what the kind of intentions are and the space that it takes place in. It's interesting for us that I would say that we've made a virtue of not having very much on-site space at the Serpentine. So there's the kind of gallery space and then not much else. So where we have the opportunity to do those programs, they happen inside the communities elsewhere in London. So there's not a sense that people need to visit the gallery in order to gain access to that kind of facility and research and thinking and support. And similarly, we have been known to sort of work in offsite project ways and install things elsewhere. But again, that's the same structure, regardless of whether it's inside the exhibition space or somewhere else in the city or the world, because people go to it in order to get the thing that they expect and then leave. We try to surprise people, but that is the kind of exhibition structure, as opposed to an education or workshop or project or learning structure.
Sure. I'm just conscious of the time, so
yeah.
I'll just.
I know we started a bit late. I've got 5 minutes.
I'll just. Of course, the Serpentine celebrates its 50th anniversary this year, and just reading up a little bit about the institution itself, it's always had this reputation for being, I suppose, quite. I don't really want to use the word progressive, but sort of experimental, and it has a very forward-looking philosophy in terms of the types of works that it chooses to engage with. I'm just interested in your opinion on why the Institute has been so successful over such a long period, and where do you see that success going in the next sort of 10, 15 years? So yeah, take it away.
I think it's been successful because partly because of its scale versus ambition, which are two very different things for us, and partly because of in my time there, I've been there for 8 years now, partly of a kind of series of shifts that have happened within my time, but with hindsight as well, that I can see that was something that is somehow built into the gallery. So to lead with the first point, because I do think it's probably one of the most pertinent, is that the scale of the two buildings now is really on the level of a small Kunsthalle, such as exists in Europe, and which is relatively rare in the UK, because where galleries of a similar scale and sort of ambition do exist around the country, they tend to be the gallery of a smaller city, and have a relationship to, or partly run by, the local council. And that relationship then is very different from the relationship and situation that we have within the Royal Parks and within the sort of London art scene as a whole. That's in no way to denigrate that other relationship. It just means that the Serpentine, as a site, as a couple of buildings within London, is relatively unusual within London. And the fact that each building is such a small building comparatively, means that we can do quite ambitious things that simply wouldn't be possible because of how expensive they would become if the building was bigger. And again, I'm speaking from exhibitions perspective here. And in terms of the shifts that have taken place, I think for a gallery within 50 years to have gone from, before it existed being being built as a tea room and a artillery storage, respectively, that's what the two buildings' original purposes were, to in the 1970s being sort of turned into a very experimental site that was linked to, first of all, to the art school, the RCA, and then the Hayward Gallery, and through the Arts Council. It had all these different kind of lineages of scope and intention and ambition. And that it wasn't until the 1990s that it became sort of cemented as a contemporary art space with its own infrastructure and funding, and sort of gradually grew through that. And then the addition of the Pavilion Commission in 2000 gave it a sort of a new layer of programming that also then added to its visibility. And the addition of our current artistic director in 2006, 5 or 6, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, and he brings his own kind of international network and ambition, has meant that it's kind of continued to have these shifts in terms of kind of connectivity to other platforms. And then really, since I've been there, that the addition of the second building and the addition of, for example, our chief technology officer, which is an unusual position to have within a contemporary art space, has meant that we've continued to look for different ways of becoming connected to different kinds of creative thinking and practice. And those changes have continued. I think there's never a point at which the gallery has said, well, we know what we're doing now, and we're just going to keep doing it. And even, my development of a design program within the Serpentine, which started in a conversation 2 years ago, was at a point where we were saying, well, this is what the program looks like, but what could it look like? What more could we do with it? So I think that attitude of constant reflection on the program as a whole, and then looking into the details of separate expertises or interests or researches, and then additional networks that the institution can become a part of in order to help sort of support and foster that conversation, is what keeps it exciting, certainly for me. And I think for the next, I can't answer for all of it, but one of the current programs that we were working on for this summer, which of course has been delayed until next year, but which has remained a kind of core part of our program, is this turn to the ecological. And really on the basis of our 50th anniversary, we'd all agreed that we didn't want to do a kind of retrospective of the institution, because who cares about that beyond the institution? It's a real it's patting yourself on the back kind of moment. And so we thought, well, if we have to put a marker down as a kind of anniversary, the more interesting question is, what does a 50-year period signify at this moment in time? Particularly at a moment in time right now where the next 50 years look increasingly uncertain. And that if, as an institution, we have to question whether or not we're going to remain relevant at all in 50 years or 500 years, and what the role of art and artists can be and continue to be. And so while that is a core question for all the programming and thinking and research that we were doing up until this year, and which we're now continuing into next year, that will remain at the heart of the program, I think, going forwards, as long as we're all working there, as long as the current team is still there, because I don't think it's possible for for arts organizations at such a kind of unique and potentially catastrophic moment, to, you know, how can we continue to support and shore up culture if we don't address the thing that is most threatening to the continuance of culture, which is the ecological crisis. And I think most organizations have found ways to integrate that into their programming. But it's something that we're trying to apply, not just from what we present to the public, but also how we work internally. How can we make the organization more resilient? How can the buildings become greener? All of these things that we're trying to apply throughout the whole structure of the organization was really the only thing that we felt could even begin to answer that question of what is the next 50 years.
Yeah, and I think that is an important part of the conversation for all such institutes. You have to start thinking about tomorrow's threats and how you adapt going forward. And with the Serpentine, as you said, they're in a unique space in that they almost operate in their own sort of world, separate from the big London galleries. But I hope that you're able to find, you know, opportunities going forward to at the very least, preserve what you have.
Well, me too.
On that note, I just want to thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
It's been absolutely, you know, an invaluable opportunity, and I just want to say thank you.
You're most welcome, and yeah, thanks for getting in touch. It's always nice to, you know, help where we can if there is research being done, and yeah, and talk more about how we try and think and put together the organization from the inside. It's not always apparent to us, so it's quite nice to have these moments to try and sort of clarify that externally. It's yeah, it's always enjoyable, and good luck with the rest of your research.
Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon. Bye bye.